We can now project the winner of the presidential race. CNN projects Donald Trump wins the presidency.
In less than 48 hours, Donald J. Trump will be sworn in as the 45th President of the United States of America. However, Donald Trump received almost 3 million less votes than Hillary Clinton. So how is it then that come Friday, he'll be moving into 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue? Well, it's all thanks to the Electoral College, a system of voting that Americans use to pick their head of state. So what is the Electoral College, and what would it look like if Australia employed this unique style of democracy? The United States is the only country on the planet to indirectly elect their president through this system of voting. In the United States, the president isn't selected by the population, but instead is selected by a group of individuals known as electors. And as we saw only 2 weeks ago, the candidate who wins the popular vote doesn't always win the presidency. This has happened on 4 separate occasions throughout the US's 238-year history. The most memorable occasion being in 2000, when Al Gore received 500,000 more votes than George W. Bush, but still lost the presidency. This is because when your average US citizen heads down to the polls, they aren't voting for the Democratic or Republican candidates. Instead, they're voting for an elector who will then vote on their behalf. Each state receives 1 elector for each representative it has in Congress, and an additional elector for each of its senators. There are an additional 3 electors given to the District of Columbia that has no congressmen or senators. This totals out to being 538 electors. The candidate that wins the majority of the electors, that's 270, wins the presidency. So far, this doesn't sound too dissimilar to the Australian parliamentary system, in which each electorate nominates a representative to Parliament. The party with the majority of representatives forms a government, and their party leader then becomes Prime Minister. But I'm afraid that's where the similarities end. You see, in the US's Electoral College, each state is guaranteed a minimum of 3 electors, regardless of the state's population. Vermont has a population of 626,000, and it's allocated 3 electors. The state of New York, on the other hand, has a population of 19.75 million, and it's allocated 31 electors. This means that in Vermont, there's 1 elector for every 168,000 people. But in New York, it's closer to 1 elector for every 535,000 people. This means that a vote in Vermont is worth 3 times as much as 1 cast in New York. And that's only the start. In 49 of the 51 US states, they employ a winner-takes-all mentality when it comes to how electors are distributed. It's called first-past-the-post voting. What this means is, regardless of whether your candidate loses by 1 or 1 million votes, those electors are given to the popular winner in that state. This is especially disappointing if you live in a state where one party wins the majority over and over again. If you're a Republican from California or a Democrat from Texas, your vote essentially doesn't count. This leads to almost 80% of US votes having no impact on the presidency whatsoever. And it's why these elections are so often decided by a handful of swing states, which have the potential to vote one way or the other. And unlike in Australia, where preferential voting allows for third parties, the American first-past-the-post rule means that voters can only ever really choose between a Republican and a Democratic candidate, since it would be almost impossible for a third party to win enough votes to secure the majority in that state. So what would this system look like in Australia, and how would it have affected our 2016 election? Well, according to John Hart, a political scientist from the Australian National University, Australia would have had a Liberal president from 2004 all the way through to 2016, with the only exception being in 2007 when Kevin Rudd would have won the election. Here's how it would work. Electors would be allocated to each state in the same way they are in America, with each electorate, which is our equivalent of a congressional district, being allocated 1 elector, and an additional 2 electors for the senators from each state. This leaves Queensland with 42 electoral votes, New South Wales with 60, Victoria with 49, South Australia with 23, Western Australia with 28, Tasmania with 17, and the 2 territories with 4 each. This totals to 226 electoral votes, with each candidate needing to secure 114 of them to win the election. And although our recent election would have turned out much the same, because of this first past the post voting rules, if just 2.69% of Queenslanders or 1.44% of Victorians had voted the opposite way, Mr. Shorten would have received enough electoral votes to claim the presidency. The Electoral College is without a doubt a bizarre voting system. It reinforces a two-party system, gives certain votes an unfair weight, and doesn't allow for third-party candidates. So maybe it's time the US ditched its 229-year-old antiquated voting system and started having a discussion about what kind of democracy it wants to be going into the future.